no highways, no cars, no highways, no cars, toll the heck out of everybody. We don't care. Surprisingly, there really was a lot of robust conversation and concern about kind of the program, and really the message that I was probably most surprised by was the consistent message of we need to have revenue sharing in place for the counties and the cities. And that was across the board. That was the very robust conversation on that topic. So I thought that was pretty intriguing part of the conversation. We only had, I mean, of the presenters that were invited, I believe there were only two people that were able to make it, and they were both kind of the local streets advocates type groups, and the rest of us did our 2 minutes, and I plan on attending Gladstone as well coming up. So hopefully there'll be enough room there for the thousands of people that may show up. That's all I've got. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, Commissioner, go ahead.
Just the only thing I will add, attending all three, is that the common denominator, Councilor Sherman pointed out one of them. The common denominators were one of which was the revenue sharing, but more significantly was the wide range of concerns from constituents about diversion. So that was a topic at every one of the every one of those hearings. So I'm sure it'll be a topic at the fourth one as well. But I thought it was great to hear the street advocates and some of the advocacy groups and the local businesses in the Southeast Portland one talk about what I think they called it spillage or the diversion into their community. So it's an issue everywhere. But obviously it's more pronounced where we are because there's not much of a grid structure. There's not much in transit. There's not much of anything other than 205 itself. So I'll stop there. Yield back.
Mayor Milch.
Somebody somewhere posted a video of somebody talking about the definition of diversion, whether it was an ODOT or OTC, I can't remember, but they said that's positive diversion and negative diversion. We've rarely heard the word diversion used to describe people choosing public transit as opposed to an automobile as their means of transportation. But I like the term spillover. That was pretty clear in its meaning that we were hearing from a lot of the folks in East Portland, meaning people getting off the freeway and coming into their neighborhoods. And that's the kind of diversion that we have, that's the meaning of that word that we have always meant when we've used it. And I agree with the other people this morning that's a common theme to people in neighborhoods, that they don't want cars exiting and driving through as a way of avoiding tolls or avoiding congestion, either one.
I would also note that on that point, just a couple months ago, I was going through Westland during rush hour, and my maps suggested me to take alternative routes through the local surface streets, and that's what I did, and it saved me a lot of time, and that's what a lot more people are going to do probably. So a big takeaway I have, if there's no one else, is like Commissioner Savas said, in Wilsonville there was a big. Oh, Trent, go ahead.
Oh, I could wait till after you finish your comments.
Okay. Well, there was a contingent of folks who were concerned about possibly getting a carve out for the residents of Charbonneau because they're landlocked. And while that's something that I totally empathize with, one of the reasons I think we need to be united on this is that the more carve outs there are, the easier it is for us to say, well, okay, well, why not my community? And then it gets to the point where it's finally like, if you're going to make so many carve outs, I know that they've got their low income equity and mobility thing that's supposed to be coming out soon as well. It's when there's so many costs already, and then you're taking out a lot of other people, at what point does it become financially infeasible if it isn't already that way already? And so that's one of my big concerns. While I greatly sympathize with the fact that there are a lot of retirees in that community, and that low-income folks will be more hit by this. It's just, it becomes a financial question. Trent, go ahead.
Thanks. And I don't really have any comments about the Wilsonville meeting. I was going to start helping transition to the Oregon City Gladstone Westland meeting. So Mayor Bialostowski, if you're responding to the Wilsonville comments, again, I'm happy to defer.
Oh, sure. Just one comment on the topic of carve outs. One of the things that was interesting to me to notice was that a lot of push for the Charbonneau carve out, but then the overall situation is that at the STRAC table, that was where exemptions and carve outs were discussed at the rulemaking advisory committee. They finished their work. Folks weren't included in that process from our governments, but that work is done. And so it's really going to take legislative intervention, I think, or potentially OTC intervention to stop that train, because they're basically saying low income toll program is it. No other carve outs except for very limited cases. The draft rules are available to review. They're carving out for emergency vehicles and a few other vehicle types, but basically the situation is low income toll program is the only official, carve out in the rules that have been recommended to OTC by STRAC. And I understand there was some controversy at the STRAC table of whether there was even a recommendation or how the group never reached consensus. I've heard from some members. So concerning that there seems to be a disconnect between what the public and legislators may understand about what's happening and what's actually rolling down the tracks. With that conversation has sort of been closed.
So thank you for that, Mayor, and everyone's reaction, I think, is really spot on with what staff has been hearing as well at these meetings. And so I think that's really encouraging that there's consistent messaging that's going on throughout these community groups. I wanted to help y'all start thinking about the January 6th meeting. And actually, Mayor Bialostowski, what you were just talking about is a good segue into this. Recall that this subcommittee was put in place at the same time as the pause on toll collections, right? And back in May, and that came as a little bit as a result of the bill that was introduced there in, I think, April, that was calling for similar but different sort of milestones to sort of help ODOT slow down or encourage ODOT to slow down, work with local jurisdictions more, and be able to give you access to a lot of questions or answers to questions that y'all were asking. And I think what we're hearing is that some of those questions from y'all and your departments and your divisions and your agencies are still out there and still unanswered. And I think that the value of these town halls or community meetings is to remind these legislators what those questions are, or what those opportunities are that might require that legislative intervention that you're talking about, Mayor Bialostowski, or others, other interventions that you're hoping this legislative subcommittee will flag. Because I think after these committee meetings, it will be incumbent upon the subcommittee to say, this is what we heard. These were the questions that we heard. Now, what do we do with those questions? And will ODOT be able to answer them before the subcommittee can make their final recommendation, which will be, I think, near the end of the short session here. So no later than May 10th or something like that. Or sorry, March 10th. So I would just keep that in mind as you're getting ready for this upcoming January 6th meeting. Recall that at your last subcommittee meeting, you had like a list of questions that were sort of along the lines of, what is ODOT's plan for A, B, and C? And that list was derived from a lot of the consternation or a lot of the comments that we're hearing here at C4. I would encourage you to hearken to those, because I think that asking questions in those ways gives that subcommittee the tools that they need to engage ODOT in that public dialogue, in that public forum, to come back and try to answer those questions and give them a chance to answer it sufficiently. That's the process that this subcommittee, in my memory, was designed to go and do. Look under the hood, see if this project is actually going to be able to drive itself or meet the need of both the legislature and the community. So I think I would encourage you to think about that. What I do know about the committee is that there are, at least so far, we're aware of 5 invited speakers at the January 6th meeting. So it's the 3 mayors. That's Commissioner Savas. I believe Councilor Lewis is invited as well. I think there are probably a couple of others. And so there will be some initial testimony up front. As you can imagine, we're working with some of y'all in addition to this meeting to sort of organize some of the comments so that it's similar but not super repetitive, so that you can capture a lot of what you've been talking about. But obviously it's not limited to that. It's a 2-hour meeting. There's plenty of opportunity to come and testify. outside of those invited speakers. If you're keen on doing that, please come do it.
Commissioner Savas.
Yeah, to build on this a little bit, I'm gonna just reckon back to what I heard everyone say. I thought all the mayors at the Wilsonville one did a great job of bringing some really key points, and not to be forgotten. Those can't be forgotten. So we need to make sure, even though they've been said, to at least you know, touch on those. But the one thing I heard Representative Courtney Neuron say, which is where I'm headed with this, is that one of her statements, I thought she did a great job, by the way, but one of her statements in particular that jumped out at me is that I think she used the words weigh the economic impacts. And there was some business voices that did speak up at the Southeast Portland one that were business related, but I didn't hear a lot of that at the Wilsonville one or the first one. So I think it's important knowing that Main Street, Oregon City, Westland, Willamette Falls Drive, Gladstone, a number of the areas, those are all going to be heavily impacted. But the business will be heavily impacted. I think that voice needs to be very pronounced. And also, let's like Trent was talking about, let's put ourselves in the shoes right now of the people that on the subcommittee, the state legislators that are there. They don't know. I'm from talking to them, I realize that they're not even aware that there is not an economic impact. There's not an EIS here. There's been no study of the economic impacts to businesses or to all the things that would be included in an EIS. So be mindful of that. I think that needs to be a very strong message. And I would even go so far as to say that even Lake Oswego's has economic impacts. Highway 43 and Stafford Road into McVeigh, all of that just pours more people on the 43. Anyhow, I think that's this area. I think that needs some strength or some discussion.
Mayor Milch.
I do remember one person, I don't know if it was Chamber of Commerce or whatever it was from Wilsonville speaking to that issue. Most of the time when people speak to that issue, there's going to be too much traffic. People won't be able to get to my business or, things along that line related to diversion. But I think we need to look at that issue in a broader sense as well, statewide. If we make these substantial increases in the cost of getting access to our transportation system, which could be as much as a 12-fold increase for an individual paying a small gas tax now and a huge amount of tolls later. That will add to the cost of shipping and producing products and sending them to the market, and that will increase prices. So people will be feeling this economic impact, even if they're not paying the tolls themselves, because everyone who provides everything that serves them in the community will be paying for these tolls. So that needs to be a part of the way we approach this issue, beyond the impact on individual local businesses.
Thank you. Councilor Sherman.
Yeah, I think, one of the things I'm kind of trying to wrap my head around right now is, we've had, I think we talked about this before, the idea of kind of keeping messaging really consistent for this group, because we're going to have, a lot of people in front of them speaking in 2-minute blocks, and for them to try to take away a lot of information can be very difficult, very confusing. And I'm always concerned that we're, we have issues around diversion and safety and revenue and low income equality and net versus gross revenue and for each of us to get up and give our 2 minutes or so, or a couple people on each of these, does that, and I'll rely on staff or the smart people in the room to kind of help me understand this. Does it water down our message? Is it more powerful to kind of stick with our 2 or 3 key kind of questions that need to be asked ultimately? And the reason I ask this is, I was just kind of crunching some of the numbers on the low income toll offsets, and somebody who's making $110 a day effectively is going to spend at least $10 a day in tolls, if not more, once we put the rest of the system in place. So 8% of your gross revenue is going to go to tolling alone before you do anything else. those are, to me, those are powerful numbers. And especially when you start incorporating a family of four, the problem you have is if you make $110 a day, you get a discount. If you make $111 a day, you don't, you get zero. So, and I know that they've been looking at maybe bringing that up to 400% of poverty level, but I have a lot of concerns with that. And then the fact that, less than 5% of people typically sign up for programs like that in the first place. So anyway, my point being, as we kind of go through this process of crafting messaging, I mean, does the group feel like, should we try to kind of keep this to a couple of key points that we're kind of hitting over and over and over again? Or is it also just as valuable to get the information out there so they have all those different pieces of information? Any thoughts from any of the staff or the group? Thanks.
Go ahead, Trent.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what y'all's work in November to sort of secure those categories of discussion items was, I think, the initial work to make sure that there is consistency in your message. So there are very common themes that have been in your letters, in your communications, in your conversations with ODOT and here at C4, right? You're worried about diversion, you're worried about safety, you're worried about economics, you're worried about the ability, like you said, families to pay. There's still a lot of unanswered questions, and it's framed out in that way. Transit and alternative modes, I think, is also in that sort of categorical list. So each of y'all can say those things, but I think the value of it to the legislature, as I always feel when I'm helping my commissioners prepare testimony, is what's the story of Clackamas County as it relates to this topic. Yes, we're concerned about diversion. Clackamas County's concern about diversion is, yes, the same as it is in Westland and Wilsonville and Gladstone, but Commissioner Savas is the elected official of the Stafford area in particular. And so, we would cater like that story of what diversion might mean to Borland Road. And hopefully that complements the concern about diversion in the Westland. So it creates the full picture by y'all sort of taking, yes, the diversion or the safety mechanisms, but spreading it across the unique and individual stories within your communities. And so that's kind of how we've always recommended doing it. It creates the same message. Oh, everybody said diversion, but look, it's spread across this topic. You can do the same thing with safety. You can do the same thing with transit. So that's how I would encourage you to think about walking into that room, is making sure that you're telling Councilor Sherman Happy Valley's heartburn about this, or your opportunities, or your, whatever approach you want to take, but make it Happy Valley specific under those umbrellas.
Thank you, Trent. And I was just going to say, it's very convenient for us that we have a lot of talking points already on our joint tolling values document. But something that I've done is I've also talked to our public works staff here in Oregon City to get some more definitive numbers so that I can personalize it to the narrative that I'm trying to push forward for Oregon City. And so the reason why they're having these different regional ones is so that they can hear. And I think it would be most impactful if they hear the same thing, that diversion is a thing, but tailored to each of our individual regions that we all represent, and hearing that it's going to be a common theme. Councilor Baumgardner.
Thank you. I will just make a point off of that story message that Mayor Melch gave the most impactful testimony at the Southeast Portland PCC presentation. I was just talk about telling a story. That was really effective. I was going to say also to Councilor Sherman's points about the amount of money we're talking about for impacting individual households. I think it's very important to, at the same time, making that point, make the point of how far is each dollar going to go, because that's the really important message that I'm seeing. We're not being told. There's been a concerted effort to prevent transparency on that exact question. How much of my dollar is going to actually go, to tolling and administration, and how much is going to come back and help our infrastructure and actually pay? So I think that's an important point that obviously others have brought up in the past. I also wanted to say one more thing. I want to focus on what the message we've been getting from ODOT from the very beginning. When they first came to our council meeting, the very first question I asked Lucinda Broussard, who was presenting, was, are municipalities going to be given funding and help with mitigation of diversion? And the answer was an absolute unequivocal no. No. So, I mean, they changed their messaging on that, but never the actual answer, at least in West Lynn's case. So I think there's a lack of transparency, a lack of public access to the information, the data, and the legislation. The legislators need to hear that. The lack of public access and the lack of transparency into what's actually happening. And that's an important message at these meetings. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor. That's a great point. John?
So I called on.
Yes.
Okay, my screen seemed to freeze. Anyway, the other thing that we need to do is email in everything to this legislative committee. So what they don't possibly get on the meeting on the 6th, you can send stuff in advance. And some of the key items is they've talked about the congestion in the Portland area. And the reality is it's 68% more between Clark County and Portland. They have 68% more congestion than we do. And this whole thing, what I look at it, is it all began as a toll for congestion, and now it's a toll to build the roads. And they are mixing up, and it keeps on changing. So when you ask for more detailed public records information, they refuse to give it to you. And they go, well, we don't have the number. And you go through another source and you find out they do have the number. I think the legislature needs to know they refuse to turn over any public records. And I think I do not understand ODOT's attitude of, if the OTC agrees, it goes through. Wrong. The Federal Highway Administration has to agree to it also. And if you take this state of New York, which is trying to do a congestion pricing in Manhattan, it's been over a decade and a half. And so the reality is I think the tolling of the Abernathy Bridge, which is in the meetings for today, has to be scrapped. They don't have enough time. Don't build the gantry, because it's not going to be approved. Even though the governor says go ahead, the feds can say no, there's litigation coming on, everything's delayed. And so if ODOT decides to ever tell us the truth, maybe things can move forward. I think they think is, if they tell us more of the truth, we're going to realize there's no need for a toll in this area. The tolls should be up between Clark County. They do that in Kentucky. They do that in Indiana. They do that in Pennsylvania for border states, so that the other state can start paying for some of the revenue for roads. Because if they buy all their gasoline in the state of Washington, they pay nothing for our roads. And so we need to email in everything we can to OTC, to the legislature, to the Federal Highway Administration. Everybody has to know what our message is.
Thank you, John. For the sake of time, Mayor Milch, and then we're going to move on to our discussion with Ms. Putney.
Picking up a little bit on what Councilor Baumgartner said, one of the things that's also unclear is what is the value, what are we going to get out of this in terms of reduction in congestion? Many of these projections that are in their reports spread out to the year 2045, and I don't think they're seeing a sudden drop off in congestion that will maintain itself for the next 22 years. I think we can assume it's a very gradual reduction. And based on the percentages of reduction in congestion or drive time, we're looking at maybe a 1% increase each year. So if a 40-minute commute takes 39 minutes and 30 seconds next year, that's really not worth paying $100 or $200 a month in tolling. So more clarification on what really the time benefits are going to be for paying into this tolling system. And I fully agree about the net versus gross. The cost of the infrastructure, the cameras, everything involved is going to be a big chunk of this, and it's not money well spent. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Just some closing thoughts I have. First, getting back to the economic impacts, which was the most important thing that I was looking forward to seeing in the draft EA, and disappointed to see that the economic impacts are the hundreds of temporary jobs that are created through construction, rather than talking about the actual effects it'll have among our brick and mortar Main Street businesses here in Oregon City. And so, as some people have talked about in the chat, I believe that staff has reached out to chambers to try and get them, but it can't hurt if we as electeds also try and push them and remind them to show up and speak out as well. So coordinating with the people who are invited from our jurisdiction. So I'm hoping to see all of you there on the 6th. And so let's move on to our ODOT transportation funding discussion with Ms. Putney.
Thanks, Mandy, for joining us today. You should be able to share your screen, but let me know if you're having any issues.
Would you also be able to promote Brent Baker? He's going to join me in this presentation. And then I think if Paul Comrie is in the audience, he'll be, oh, he's going to share. Okay, great. So it sounds like he's all set. Do we have Brent as well?
Yes, I'm here now.
Okay, great. Okay, should I just dive in?
Yeah, feel free to introduce yourselves, and then you're welcome to go forward with your presentation.
Great. Hi, good afternoon. I'm Mandy Putney with ODOT's Urban Mobility Office. I have met, I think, most of you before and came many times to the previous diversion subcommittee that existed for C4. I'm responsible in my role as the Strategic Initiatives Director with the Urban Mobility Office to oversee the analysis in coordination with the Federal Highway Administration associated with the tolling projects that are underway. We're here today to talk about one of those projects, the I-205 toll project, and specifically some financial scenarios that have recently been run and evaluated. And I have Brent Baker with me, who's a Senior Vice President at WSP. And I'll let him introduce himself when I turn it over to him. Before I do that, I wanted just to provide a couple updates about the project, just to make sure that everyone was aware of kind of where we're moving with the project and the analysis. I caught a little bit of the conversation before our agenda item, and I'll also, we can go to the next slide. I'll also just provide a few updates about the toll program. One is that there has been a statewide toll rulemaking advisory committee that was formed. They had their last meeting in November. And their key product that they worked on was draft rules for the toll program. The draft rules were discussed with the commission at the last meeting and are currently with the Department of Justice for legal review, and then they will go out for public review in 2024. So more conversation to come about those rules. They're not finalized at this point, and they are available in their draft form if you're interested in reviewing them. Continuing to work closely with the Toll Program Equity and Mobility Advisory Committee, we've continued to move forward a low-income toll program and have a decision and direction from the commission, which also came at their last meeting, to have a low-income toll program on day one of implementation, which would provide at least a 50% discount for people that have up to 200% of the federal poverty level in terms of income. And that program would be available for residents in Oregon and Washington. And so we'll continue to do additional analysis at the commission's direction to look at the 200 to 400% of the federal poverty level range. So those are kind of bigger program elements. And then I want to just provide some updates about the I-205 toll project. We have adjusted the scope of the I-205 toll project following the finance plan that was provided to the governor this summer. And so our project, as we're moving forward, is looking at tolling at the Abernathy Bridge, with tolling infrastructure planned to be within the ODOT owned right-of-way near the I-205 Oregon 43 interchange. We can go to the next slide. We'll still be using variable rate tolls as we move forward with the project, and doing this project so that we're able to contribute funding for the construction, which is underway, of the Abernathy Bridge, and that we'd be able to support congestion management goals with the variable rate toll structure. And I have one more slide to just clarify kind of the scope here. We're working with the Federal Highway Administration, who will ultimately make the decision on the federal environmental review, which is conducted under the National Environmental Policy Act process. But I do want to say, although we are reusing and using as much of the work that was done previously as possible, we are now preparing a supplemental environmental assessment. So the traffic data and information that you saw previously will be changing. And we will have that available likely in the February.
Mandy froze apparently, right?
Yeah,
Yes, it appears we've lost Mandy.
So Brent, you want to pick it up?
Sure, I'm just sending a quick text to Mandy to let her know that we've lost her. All right. I think Mandy was just leading into the work that we are here to share with you today. I am Brent Baker. I am the tolling finance task lead for the Oregon Toll Program, which includes the I-205 toll project. And we have been, earlier this year, we completed an analysis of trade-off factors in looking at tolling just the Abernathy Bridge, as Mandy had described the change in that Oregon toll program, Oregon project definition for 205. And so to look at this, I want to sort of describe the scenarios that we analyzed. Obviously, there is a no-build case, which is basically just a basis of comparison where assumes nothing is done. Scenario 0 represents the toll rates that were initially proposed to be looked at in the environmental assessment for the Abernathy Bridge only case. They are essentially, with a few tweaks, the toll rate that came from the former project, which had tolls on both the Tualatin River and Abernathy bridges. So this would be just sort of one half of that, essentially here applied to Abernathy. And it's worth noting that the project has been considered for both its congestion management and its funding needs. There is a need to pay for the Abernathy Bridge improvements, and the target for that is $400 million in capital funding from tolls. Scenario 1 was then tested to see, what if we simplified the toll schedule? Could we come up with a schedule that was flatter, i.e. just sort of a peak and off-peak rates, maybe a little bit higher in some of those off-peak times, but a little bit lower in the peak travel times? And could we still generate the 400 million capital funding target, or at least match what we generate under scenario 0? And what would be the impacts of doing that? Scenario 2 is, I think, an interesting scenario, but it's probably not one that has a lot of interest. The goal of scenario 2 was to answer the question, can we toll Abernathy alone and manage congestion in the full project area that would extend from Oregon 213 down to Stafford Road? And more on that in a moment, but that's a single toll point at the northeast end of that corridor is not going to be effective at reducing congestion at the far southwest end of it, particularly when you consider that half of the traffic, more than half of the traffic that uses or passes Stafford Road does not use Abernathy, or another way to put it is less than half the traffic crossing the Abernathy Bridge is also going as far south and west as Stafford Road. And then finally, and also that scenario, because it was just sort of peak period focused for congestion purposes, there were no overnight tolls assumed. And finally, scenario 3 is really looking at scenario 0, but raising the toll rates a little bit to see if we could target raising an additional 100 million in capital funding. And, what would those increases in tolls, how would that affect? Could you get there, and how would it affect diversion? I should note that all of the scenarios assume a low-income program allowance reduction amount, so that's factored into the revenue numbers. And then we have lowered the truck toll multipliers from the earlier work to levels that are now 1.5 times for medium trucks, and for large tractor trailers, 2 times the auto toll. I think we're ready to jump to the next slide. We can just review the toll rates briefly here. So this is the variable time of day schedule that's been assumed for analysis purposes. Obviously, the commission will make those final determinations on toll rates. They will have to be made in a way that meets the financial obligations to provide the funding needed for the project, as well as other objectives and concerns. This one shows that the afternoon peak rate is as high as 2.25. The morning peak rate is $1.95, and for many hours a day, we're at 75 cents or $1.25. There is a broader peak period in the afternoon, and it kind of ramps up and ramps down a little slower than the morning peak. So the toll rates sort of show those steps. The next slide shows the flatter, simpler scenario 1, which again, the goal was to create a 2-step toll rate schedule that would achieve the same net revenue as scenario 0. And we succeeded in that goal in terms of almost hitting it spot on the net revenue differences. This one is $1 off peak and $1.80 for a 4-hour morning and 5-hour afternoon peak period. Scenario 2, again, is answering kind of a unique question. It's not looking at just can you solve congestion on 205 right at Abernathy, but can you reduce congestion or eliminate congestion, alleviate that, and provide good speed and flow throughout the entire corridor. And the challenge here, of course, is the fact that I-205 becomes a bit of a bottleneck when you get south and west of Abernathy because of the narrowing from 3 lanes to 2. And so this is really, I think tolls on one bridge alone is really a blunt instrument if you're trying to control congestion all the way down to Stafford Road, based upon based upon this single toll point here at Abernathy. But we did test that, and you can see that the peak period toll rates need to be quite high, upwards of 5 or a little bit over 5 in 1 hour in the afternoon period, one way per trip, to have that effect. And again, this is driven by the fact that less than half the trips crossing Abernathy are actually traveling as far south as Stafford Road. There's a lot of relatively short trips on the interstate in this section, and so you really got to, takes a lot to sort of squeeze off enough traffic throughout that whole corridor to maintain good flow with 2 lanes each way. Finally, scenario 3 shows a very similar schedule to scenario 0, but just elevated a bit. It's 50% higher in the afternoon peak and about 80 cents higher in the morning peak, and a little bit higher midday as well. And again, the goal here was to generate an additional $100 million, and also to look at what happens, what are the effects on diversion and speeds and other traffic metrics when you do that. So on the following slide, this is just kind of a summary of our findings. The first row here shows the no-build analysis, but really our focus is understanding how the scenarios trade off different things among each other. We do have lots of information. I think some has probably already been supplied to you about the effects of the tolling in different sections. This is kind of a high level summary here. So again, when we're looking at this column for speeds, we're not talking about speeds just around Abernathy Bridge, but we're looking at the average in the entire corridor from Oregon 213 to Stafford Road. And all of the toll scenarios improve speeds through the corridor. Only scenario 2 with its, arguably quite high tolls does that get to sort of free flow conditions at all times of the day. Under the other scenarios, there will be portions of the corridor at certain times of the day that are operating at lower speeds, such that we're averaging about 35 to 40 miles an hour in scenario 0, 1, and 3. In terms of, and that's really kind of shown in the second column there with the hours of stop and go or congested conditions and assumed to be forecasted here for 2027. And, between scenario 0 and 1, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 6 hours of the day, somewhere in the corridor, we're going to have stop and go conditions, not necessarily throughout the entire length of it. And that diminishes to 4 hours of the day when we go to those higher tolls under scenario 3. And again, the tolls in scenario 2 were set high enough to sort of eliminate that from happening, but arguably with some pretty adverse effects. Notably, as shown in the third column over here, significant diversion. We would expect quite a bit of diversion there. And in fact, the analysis tools that we used for this trade-off analysis are primarily focused on one's route choice. Obviously, when we talk about tolls that are that much higher than sort of our basis of comparison scenario 0, we're starting to get into a range where people are going to be changing their destination or their frequency of travel or their mode of travel. And those things aren't captured here. So I think the results for scenario 2, if there's interest in that, in the unlikely event that there is, that one would probably warrant some further analysis. Among those, though, scenarios 0 and 1 have the least amount of diversion. Scenario 2, of course, the most significant diversion when we're talking about arterial road impacts diversion. Again, diversion can take different forms, but here we've been, with the tools we've used for this specific level 1 analysis, we've been focused on the route choice. And then scenario 3 is moderate. It's a bit higher than scenario 0 and 1, but nowhere near the level of arterial route diversion to arterial routes that scenario 2 has. And then the last is just a column is just showing a relative comparison of net revenue compared to scenario 0. Scenario 1 and 0 are about the same. Scenario 2 could arguably provide a lot more revenue. And scenario 3 provides, maybe a third more net revenue. So if we'll jump to the next slide, we can just maybe summarize this by talking about the financial capacity in terms of toll funding contribution. Using these preliminary draft results, ODOT and their financial advisor have analyzed how debt can be structured and repaid with that net toll revenue stream. And what they have concluded is that you can get pretty darn close to, but not quite up to that $400 million funding need for the Abernathy Bridge with either scenarios 0 or 1. Doing so requires kind of not just toll revenue bonds, but leveraging a USDOT TIFIA loan, which is something that ODOT is looking into carefully. And then I think, the scenario 3, the tolls that we tested there did sort of achieve the goal of generating another 100 million or so in capital funding, going from about that 370 range to about that 470 range. And then finally for scenario 2, definitely more capital funding possible there. But again, I think the results of that one, while probably unappealing from the toll rates themselves, I think, would sort of warrant more analysis if there was really interest in going that route. So I think just some kind of final takeaways here. There really isn't a perfect toll rate structure that will achieve or accomplish all objectives, whether it be funding, congestion relief, minimizing diversion to arterial routes. It's always a balancing act, and you need to sort of find out what's sort of the fair and reasonable trade-off that meets those objectives, particularly when tolling is needed, not just as a congestion relief mechanism, but also as a need to generate capital funding to pay for infrastructure. In this case, the Abernathy Bridge. So, there are, I think another sort of key message here is that there are different, or I should say similar revenue and funding levels can be achieved with different rate structures. We saw that between scenarios 0 and 1. So there's, the commission will have some thinking to do about what the trade-offs are if we, and how you structure that variability by time of day to achieve those goals. Obviously, if you're tolling a little bit lower rates in the peak period, there's more chance for congestion now or in the future. And you might, as a result of doing that, have to charge people who have the discretion to travel at lower cost times a bit more than they otherwise would have paid. The 400 million funding target, can be achieved, assuming a combination of toll bonds and a TIFIA loan, but potentially, more further forecasting work would be needed for scenarios 0 and 1, and might require ever so slightly higher rates to get to that mark, based upon where they're coming in now at about 370 million. And I think finally, definitely a point from this one, if we look at tolling the Abernathy Bridge only, and given the current status of the corridor there not being widened south and west of Abernathy, tolls at the Abernathy Bridge are not an efficient way to manage project corridor congestion throughout. They work very well at managing congestion around the bridge, but given the bottleneck of the capacity change there on the highway, and the pattern of trips that don't have a lot of through trips in the region, it's not going to be effective for solving a congestion problem the closer you get to Stafford Road. So I'll pause there. I imagine there's a number of questions, and then Mandy can probably wrap up with some next steps.
All right, Commissioner Savas.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. Could you roll back to the slide? I think it was 10, one with the table. There you go. Up back. There you go. That one there. Can you, Brent, could you give me some better definition of what least diversion is in car count?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's not one I can just answer off the cuff, because we analyzed congestion at 9 points along different key diversion routes, and then those measurements are made at different times of the day. So it's going to vary based upon which of those key points we analyzed and what time of day we're looking at and that kind of thing. So I think to respond to that, we could certainly put together some additional information, but I can't give you an exact number of cars at a particular point right here off the cuff.
Okay, how about the delta between least and significant? Can you give us a range there, what that would be?
These are somewhat qualitative statements after looking at the quantitative data at all of those points on key diversion routes at the various times of day and also in different travel directions. So significant is clearly we saw, material changes in the volume to capacity ratios, which is a sort of an engineering measure for the level of congestion on those arterial facilities. But it's not, and we saw material changes, but not just in the number itself, but going from a zone where there would be relatively good flow to the point where you have traffic flow breakdown. And, going from 0.5 to 0.7 is a lot different than going from 0.7 to 0.9. And in the significant diversion case of scenario 2, there's a lot of those facilities are getting into the range where they're just at, they're at flow breakdown, kind of as the unintended consequence of trying to manage congestion throughout the whole corridor at those very high toll rates that were tested in our scenario 2. And that one was really intended to be sort of a diagnostic scenario. Least diversion is showing that, it's a relative measure, compared to the no build and among the other scenarios looked at, but it's in general showing minor to moderate changes in volume to capacity on arterial routes. And then moderate diversion is sort of more on the moderate side there. Again, if there are, specific routes or times of day where that information is of interest, we can sort of pull that out. It's very hard to, we could, you either look at everything, which is just massive amounts of information, but it's sort of kind of hard to roll it up into something that, can be easily digested here in a presentation.
And I'll say we did provide the volume to capacity information and
Yes.
backup to RTAC on Friday afternoon. We're happy to share that packet with this whole committee. I know you may not have seen it quite yet. So if you want to look at the specific details at different points and locations, you're able to do that.
Yeah, I haven't had a chance to look at that, so I'll take a dive into what David Kim has sent out. Brent, you were there when I asked these kind of questions at the RTAC meeting.
Mhm.
I think it's very vague, and I kind of requested it, putting some kind of a metric in there to give people something, especially decision makers, something to gauge what that is. Whether is it a is difference between least and moderate. 100% increase, 50%. I mean, some kind of a metric. Car count would be ideal. But the part I find baffling here, I mean, I know you guys model this on really behavior, probably, what's people's tolerance is going to be. I know that's a variable in and of itself, but I just go back to let me just ask you this. What's the definition of NA in this table here? Use NA for the no build.
Yeah, so that's a fair question. So the term diversion is used to measure what happens to people's travel when they face a priced roadway. And so, we did share some of this at that RTAC meeting, but, a common choice is to find an alternative route that avoids the toll. That, of course, may entail additional time cost, additional fuel cost if it's an indirect routing. But people may also choose to change their destination of travel. If they're going shopping somewhere, maybe they'll choose a place that's closer to home or doesn't require the toll to be paid. They might change their frequency of travel. A common thing to see is they change their time of day to a lower cost time when faced with a price. So they're maybe not competing for the scarce roadway space at the peak period. So there's lots of ways, and then they may change mode of travel. Like, if transit were available to make the trip, they might do that as well. So there's many ways in which people react to the pricing. Because the no build has no toll associated with it, it's sort of not applicable because there's nothing to measure against a price to that. So what we tend to do is we measure the effects of diversion relative to the no build, because that is the basis without pricing from which the pricing has these effects.
Well, yeah, and I think that's where it kind of gets fuzzy. So basically the NA means not applicable or not what? I mean, what does NA stand for?
Not applicable because there's no toll in the no build. It is the basis of comparison for measuring how how many people might divert from 205 to, say, an alternative route when a toll is applied. So if there were X number of trips on 205 that then opted to use some alternative route in the toll case, then the change in vehicles would be relative to that no bill.
Okay. So I want to make a really important point here. So the column to the left of that is the hours of stop and go traffic. So we can say that under the no build, you're saying there's 7 hours of stop and go traffic. So there's 7 hours of the day of a business day where people are going to divert off the freeway because of the congestion that's there now, because the stop and go traffic. So there's diversion now, and do you have a number for that?
Well, we don't call that diversion. I mean, clearly people are choosing their particular route based upon the conditions that exist today or would exist without a toll in the future. And so some people are going to choose to use 205. Some people are going to throw their hands up and say it's too slow and congested or too unreliable, and they are going to choose some other route. Or they're going to not travel at all, is probably the case in some. And but that is just what exists today. And what we can, there's nothing without making other investments. There's nothing we can do without pricing to sort of make that substantially different. And so, but that's the basis of comparison. So when we apply tolling to Abernathy, we're then measuring how does that change things from the no build case. So I wouldn't call it diversion in terms of what exists today. I think there are people just making route choices, and think of diversion as like, how do they change those choices once pricing is applied?
Okay, well, the point I was trying to make is that if there was another column between the second and the third column to show hours of diversion, under the no build, it'd be 7 and 7. Under scenario 0, it'd be 6 to 24, because going for 24 hours diversion, because you're going to toll 24 hours a day, right? And that goes for almost all of them except scenario 2, where you're going to toll for 16 hours a day. So you're increasing the incentive by implementing a 24-hour toll to people to divert all hours of the day. And it just strikes me that the modeling should really factor in the transition between people that are driving or diverting, I'm going to use the word diversion, that are diverting because of the bottleneck today. And then they're going to, then at the 8th hour, before or after that stop and go traffic, now they're going to be diverting because of a financial disincentive to take the freeway, perhaps, or perhaps not. Maybe they'll get on, in one of those periods of time. But I just don't see how the modeling can actually not factor the existing diversion and the reason why the mental choice that they make to for a faster trip, to divert around the freeway. But that has to come to the forefront, because some people are going to choose maybe to take the freeway, and some people are going to choose simply not for economic reasons. So I don't see how you can model it. I don't see how the modeling factors in that transition, because just that psychological aspect of what incentivizes them to not take the freeway or to take the freeway. I'll stop there. I know that's really complicated, but I'll just say that those numbers got to be there. I mean, you got to put some kind of metric there, and I'll just have to request. We ought to be evaluating the existing diversion today. Call it whatever words you want to use, but we need to understand that, and I don't see how these can be factored in their model without knowing what the existing diversion is today.
Well, I think maybe a different way to describe what you're talking about here, if we want to reserve the term diversion for looking at the effect of pricing on the no build or the unpriced case, is just what are the volumes that are just how they're distributed across the network today. And that's exactly what we look at, is we look at these volumes are going to be on these arterials, are going to be this many people on 43 and this many people using the Arch Bridge, and and this many people using I-205. And that's what's the no build reflects, is how people make their choices and how that traffic gets distributed today. And then when we price the facility, that traffic gets redistributed. And in fact, there's definitely research and studies have been shown that, some people are choosing not to travel at all on 205 or a road that's priced. Some people are going to choose to travel at a lower cost time of day. Some people are going to be attracted to the facility because it flows better and maybe provides time savings and reliability that they wouldn't have had before for their particular trip. Now, that may not be the case for trips that are sort of through trips going further south if they're still encountering congestion in our toll condition. Again, because the tolling Abernathy is not a very effective tool for managing congestion in a corridor that has varying levels of capacity and kind of known bottlenecks. But it's, we can certainly look at it that way. Is like, here are the volumes that are distributed today, and here's how they get redistributed with tolling. And for some, they're going to be attracted to the facility because it'll serve them better. And for others, they will be using it less or using it at different times of the day or using alternative routes or modes as a result. And, that's where a level 2 or a level 3 traffic and revenue study will get into much more detail than what we could do here with kind of this, level 1 analysis. It was really designed to look at the relative trade-offs between these different scenarios. Like granted, tolling has some effects, but
I'm going to have to cut you off because we still have questions and I want to make sure we have time for everyone. But thank you for those questions and those answers. Councilor Sherman.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Brent, appreciate the time. So I think, and I appreciate Commissioner Savis's comments, that we're getting into semantics here. And, every layperson discusses diversion as a negative outcome, rolling off. And I think Council President Baumgartner probably made this comment using the term roll off, traffic that goes from the facility onto the adjacent facilities. And that's what when we're talking diversion, that's exactly what we're talking about. So, So that's the disconnect in the conversation. And so one could argue if you're measuring a single data point or a single piece that says least moderate or significant diversion, that's both good diversion and bad diversion. And so we can't quantify how much of that is good diversion and bad diversion. Someone riding public transportation is a good outcome from that scenario. Someone driving across the Arch Bridge is a very, very bad outcome from that same scenario. And so that's where, if we're really looking at two different things, what's the outcome from a facility volume perspective, but then what's the negative outcome to the local facilities? That's going to be much more useful to us. And as a numbers guy, as we break things into tiers and tertiles, and we're going to look at like least versus moderate, you can literally be one tick above and one tick below. And so be essentially nominally the exact same outcome, but fall into different categories. And I think that's where it's a little difficult for us to interpret that data. My question, though, I'm sorry.
Yes.
My question really is, and this actually may be a Mandy question. I apologize. I don't know how involved you've been with RMPP versus the toll, but I always have a hard time having these discussions in a vacuum. We're talking about one data point, one toll location, when the entire system is going to be tolled ultimately and create diversion and have pricing issues and all these different things that can occur. And so how do we make a good judgment on this one piece when and I don't even know what the number is now, how many toll points, how many gantries are we looking at for RMPP at this point? I mean, when we first started this process, we were talking 50 to 60. I've heard it's been as low as 10 or 15. I mean, Brent, do you have any idea kind of what that's going to look like in the future?
I can jump in, Brent.
Yeah, please do, Andy.
But do you want to talk about what was included in diversion here?
I just want to be clear to mention that this column in this table is focused on diversion to arterial routes. We've talked about diversion taking many forms, but our scoring here is looking at that diversion to arterial routes, alternate routes around.
Okay, so this is just that specific number. Okay,
that is
correct. I appreciate that. Yep, very good.
And I know we're running short on time, so we'd be happy to come back and talk about RMPP, but the short answer is that we're evaluating multiple options for RMPP. They have a wide range of potential gantry locations or infrastructure locations. So we don't have that detail yet. We've been working closely with agency staff and interested agencies, both in Oregon and Washington, as we've been doing that evaluation. So we should have more information in the next couple of months about that.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Milch.
I see that on slide 11, you're showing annual net revenue in millions projected out to the year 2030. And then you kind of convert that to how much of a bond you can buy from the federal government to have some capital funds for projects. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think the state generates something like $652 million a year in fuel tax revenue. And we're talking about $33 million, like 1/20th of that from tolling. Wouldn't a modest increase in the fuel tax generate as much revenue as this proposed tolling scenario? And why are we going to all the trouble of building gantries and buying transponders and cameras and monthly billing, credit card fees, all the rest, for something that could be done in a much simpler way? And the other thing that makes this seem kind of odd to me is you have a $2 each way toll, and somebody does a round trip, $4 a day, let's say $25, 25 days a month, they're driving on this tolled area. That's $100 a month in tolling revenue from an individual. That individual is only paying about $200 a month in gas taxes for the entire year. So we're talking about at least a six-fold increase in revenue generated by an individual driver. So I don't know why maybe it's because there's only one location for this, but the numbers just seem out of whack in terms of comparison to what you're earning now from gas taxes versus what you're projecting to earn from tolls.
Yeah, I think you make a very fair point there that the gas tax is a very efficient revenue collection method. And it has good and bad points to it. I think one of the issues with the gas tax is it charges everybody for, wherever they're using the roadway. It doesn't have any tie to a specific facility and those users. So, you'd be paying for things regardless of wherever you're consuming that fuel. But I do think that gas tax is more of a legislative decision, and perhaps Mandy, you'd like to talk about why we have this directive here to look at tolls.
I'll just briefly say that when there was the legislative direction to move forward with pricing, there also was at that point a tiered direction to raise the gas tax over a number of years, as well as registration fees. So the legislature looked at a variety of options and made a determination that multiple funding sources needed to be adjusted and a new one needed to be added.
All right, thank you. I'm just going to close this up here. I do have a question regarding the placement. So it's been a while since we've had ODOT. I think since the revised finance plan has been released, and my big concern has been the moving of the gantries and changing this to be a point toll on the Abernathy Bridge. And I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit about the rationale behind that, because it feels like this entire time when we've been trying to talk about the impacts of diversion, at least in my eyes, it seems like this is the best incentive that we can give to drivers to divert. And while I wasn't a huge fan of the original toll gantry locations, I would much prefer them to what is being proposed now, because again, it seems to me like this is the best way to get people to divert. And so I was hoping you can talk a little bit more about the rationale behind that when this revised finance plan was approved.
I can try to do a very quick answer, and also I'm happy to, have us come back and do a more detailed answer to that one if needed. But this previously we were looking at a toll at the Tualatin River bridges and also at this location at Abernathy. So we've removed the toll at the Abernathy or the Tualatin River bridges and are keeping this one. So this general location is the same as it was when we were looking at the previous version of the 205 toll project. What we have changed is we have changed the second toll collection point at the Tualatin River bridges. And we made that decision because given the amount of funding that was available to the urban mobility strategy and the related projects, there wasn't enough funding that would be available to replace the Tualatin River Bridge, add the third lane, and move forward with tolling at that location. When we moved the toll collection timeframe from late 2024 to 2026. So that shift of toll collection had financial ramifications, and that was the governor's request, was to illustrate what those were in the finance plan. And so that's what was then delivered to her this summer.
All right, thank you, Mayor Bialostowski.
Hey, thank you, Mandy and Branton. Chair Morrow, appreciate that. As I was in internet issues. A couple of questions. One related to the supplemental environmental assessment. What is the current plan on how long will be given for comment?
We've currently been discussing with Federal Highway Administration a 30-day comment period following the release of the supplemental EA, which would again be expected this summer.
So
sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, do you anticipate any extensions given to that timeline?
I'm not sure at this point. We will be using the same methods and methodologies, and again, we'll be working with traffic modeling and planning staff from all of your agencies prior to the release of that document. So we'll have those results early in 2024 for first modeling, staff review, and then broader review and discussion.
Okay, thank you. And I think you answered my second question, but I'm just going to ask you one. So will criteria for what constitutes an impact be changed at all? Because I think one of the concerns from the city of West Lynn and others was like the only forecasted impact for West Lynn was a pedestrian impact in the future, and the mitigation proposed was a flashing light for a crosswalk. So, and I think I heard you say that no, there will be the same methodologies will be used and assumptions will be used. Is that correct? So we can anticipate similar mitigation in the supplemental EA.
We still need to wait to get the data back to understand where there may be impacts and if those locations have shifted or changed, and then discuss mitigation. So we still have a lot we don't know at this point. We did develop our original methodologies with extensive agency input and FHWA input. So all of that work we want to use and honor that time and effort that was used earlier. So more to come about what will be found out.
So what constitutes an impact likely won't be changing. The methodology or the assumptions you're using.
The methods that we're using to evaluate the benefits and impacts will stay the same.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And I just wanted to, because I wanted to get to Mayor Bialostowski's point, I had a follow-up to mine just really quickly. So I understand the reasons, the way that it worked with the finance plan, but I guess I'm just still confused because even on this presentation, there was a bullet that stood out. It says tolls at Abernathy Bridge only are not an efficient way to manage project corridor congestion. And so I'm curious, when you guys are saying that, is it the assumption that it's going to start being effective once the RMPP is in place? Like, I'm just struggling to understand why that caveat would be in there so yeah, thank you.
Sure, absolutely. So we evaluated a scenario to understand kind of what could be possible. We're getting questions about what if you did tolling only to manage congestion? What would that be like? And so we evaluated that. I think what we have found, at least from our perspective, is that it's not a good tool to use to manage corridor congestion. So what we do know is that the toll at the Abernathy Bridge will be able to contribute funding to the project that's currently underway, and that we can use variable rate tolling to support congestion management at that toll point, not for the whole 205 corridor. So the purpose of tolling for the project has shifted from both revenue generation and corridor congestion management to revenue generation to support Abernathy Bridge construction and also congestion right around that toll point.
Okay. But also because of the pause, we aren't able to do that other gantry that was already there, which also impacts the amount of money that we're able to have. So it just seems like a spiral of things that continue to make the next thing worse. But I'll just leave it at that. Thank you for the presentation. We appreciate the update. We are at time, but I do know that there's one more thing left on our agenda. So Brian, if you had anything to close us off, or Trent.
Brian was in a building that had a fire alarm, so you get me back for a couple of minutes. I think that this final agenda item can postpone until next month.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for the information. Mandy, did you have one last thing?
I was just going to say, if you do have feedback about any of these scenarios or trade-offs, please do send them my way. We'll be talking to the commission again about these scenarios and the trade-offs before we start our level 2 traffic and revenue analysis. So if you agree with us that like the congestion management scenario shouldn't be further evaluated and that's not a realistic scenario for this project, that would be great. If you have any input about whether having less of a difference between the peak and the off-peak tolls, you know, which then means overall there might be a higher toll, but you get the same revenue, you know, general revenue capacity at the end, like that sort of information would be really helpful right now. Or if you have questions that you hope would be addressed and answered during the level 2 analysis, those would also be helpful. So information that we receive before the next commission meeting in January will be shared with the commission as we're talking to them and getting direction on kind of the scenarios that will be included in the level 2 analysis.
All right, real quick, Commissioner Savas, then Mayor Bielostowski.
Mandy, I'm not sure when you got back online after you froze there, but I did have a question I would like to get an answer to, not necessarily now today, obviously, but I would like to get an idea what ODOT sees as the existing diversion today on business days. It's hard for me to fathom that we don't know what that number is. So whatever you could do, maybe we could talk offline. I can send you an email making that request.
Yeah, absolutely. We've been working with our statewide traffic planning unit to try to get a better understanding of current travel patterns. And my takeaway from the traffic modeling conversations I've been on the fringes of is that it's technically very challenging, and we're interested in trying to figure it out. So if you have ideas, I'm happy to hear them, and we are working on it.
All right, thank you.
Go ahead, Mayor.
Hey, thank you. And this is a comment for the group C4, we're strategy segment. We're here together today. So I just wanted to add a couple of comments. We received some financial information from ODOT, and I'm guessing Brent had a large role in preparing it. But just wanted to point out, you know, the funding availability that we have is for project funding. Okay, in the different scenarios is 369 million to 371 million for scenario 1 and 0, and then 469 million for scenario 3, which is kind of the higher tolls. But the financial spreadsheet, which we could share, we got it, but it shows that for scenario 3, for example, to raise 469 million in project funding, it will take $3.2 billion in gross revenue total to generate that level of funding, 469 million. So there's a lot of questions about how this is an efficient way to fund transportation projects, because that's a lot of money to have to raise for 400 to reach the revenue target of 469 million. So I'll share that spreadsheet with everybody. But interesting observation.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone. Hope you all have a Merry Christmas and a happy holiday, and look forward to seeing you all on the 6th.
Thank you.